Hi, Chris here. I'm a doctor, I've done some leadership training, and I've got a leadership job. And I'd like to summarise a great book on leadership. It's called The Dichotomy of Leadership, Balancing the Challenges of Extreme Ownership to Lead and Win by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. So this is written by former soldiers who were leaders in the SEALs, and then they became management consultants, outlining leadership guidance to CEOs. Throughout the book, it highlights dichotomies of leadership. So these are relating war scenarios to business. And being able to actually recognize a dichotomy is halfway there, because then you've understood that there's a decision to be made, and being aware of these two opposing forces can help you develop great leadership skills. The book captures your attention starting off in a war zone scenario and highlights that even the most junior SEAL operators have to make decisions that can impact on the entire operation. Therefore, each individual SEAL needs to have the tactical and operational savvy to make important decisions quickly, confidently, and to do this, robust training is required. The first example I'll mention that's a dichotomy of leadership is knowing when to lead and when to follow. So when to be practicing leadership or followership. And be ready to learn from others' expertise and ideas. Listen to your team, and it doesn't really matter who's more experienced. If somebody else has a great idea, certainly follow this, but don't be too worried about who will take credit. It's for the good of the whole organization that you have to think about first. But it's a difficult dichotomy because at times you still do have to be the leader, and at times you won't go with what other people's suggestions are. And another dichotomy would be this taking extreme ownership, just as the title suggests. And that's when you are thinking about everything and not really giving your team the opportunity to thrive. And it's the ultimate dichotomy, in fact, that a combat leader faces is about liking their team and having their duty of care to their troops, but also to the mission. And a good leader will build powerful, strong relationships with their subordinates, but the leader also has to do everything to help the mission, and that's difficult. And certainly the book mentions that people in the army, they don't just blindly follow orders as some people would believe. And if your relationship with your team members is too close, at times you can't make the best decisions, because then your emotions come in, and then potentially you're not making the tough choices, and your team could fail the mission. But equally, you need to care for your team, and you can't just think, well, the mission is everything. So that's a dichotomy. And if you manage that wrong, your team will fall apart and they'll think that you don't respect them. This book contains great information about micromanagement. And if you're micromanaging a team, the team will just shut down mentally and rely on you to do things. So you may say, Chris, how do I identify micromanagement? Well, there's 7 principles. 1, team showing lack of initiative. Members will take no action unless directed. 2, team does not seek solutions to problems. Instead, members sit and wait to be told about a solution. 3, even in an emergency, a team that's being micromanaged will not mobilize and take action. 4, you'll find bold and aggressive action becomes rare. 5, creativity grinds to a halt. 6, the team tends to stay inside its own silo, not stepping out to coordinate with others. And 7, there's an overall sense of passivity and a failure to react. And if your team is getting some of those things, not mentioned in any particular order, it's time to take corrective action. And the key to this dichotomy is about taking too much ownership and not enough. And if you're micromanaging your team, you're taking too much ownership. And micromanagement would really be the opposite of hands-off leadership. And whereas the micromanager tries to control every thought, action of an individual team, it just doesn't work, and it inhibits growth of your subordinates. And when people become accustomed to become told what they will do, they will await direction. Initiative fades. Really don't do this. The book used an interesting example of, in business, a CEO micromanaging, and the authors would shadow this person, and he'd go from one meeting to the next where they'd all outline the problems, go in it into detail, and wait for the CEO to provide direction. And the way to overcome this was to actually cut out meetings and not be the easy solution at times. And that can be a different leadership strategy that you're already used to. There's also a bit about decentralized command and extreme ownership. So for a leader, there's often a struggle to know when to actually hold the line, stand firm and enforce rules. Whereas when do you let the rules bend? And finding that balance is critical to become the most effective leader that you can be. Because on one hand, you don't want to be too lenient, but on the other hand, you don't want to be overbearing. And you must set the standards high and drive the team to those standards. But if you're too inflexible and domineering, then it won't help. So really, to get the balance, you think of what is actually important, which are the things that matter for the strategic importance. Because there's a great concept this book introduces called leadership capital. You've only got a certain amount of this, and this builds up over time, and you can spend it on something important or foolishly on something that isn't important. But once you've used up your slowly acquired leadership capital, then the team will actually stop listening. So the book made a long story about units having badges that would show their allegiance to that squadron, and this particular squadron made their own badges and were told they shouldn't have badges. Now that was going okay, they'd slip them on until a journalist came, shot them, and they said, oh look, the platoon's wearing badges. So the leader then just took them aside and said, look, I know you've done this, but you didn't cause a big fuss, because that's obviously disobeying the direct line of command, and in the military that's a big thing. However, when it came to utilizing a radio and being able to retune it, that was vitally important to the strategic mission, and people hadn't prioritized that, he did take them to task, and they listened. And the other way of getting the team on board is to actually outline why. There is never an argument to say, because I say so. One needs to express why this is important. How will it accomplish the mission? And what are the consequences for failing to do so? And as a general point, particularly in the military, the harder a unit trains, the more its members are pushed together and the tighter the bond between them becomes. Another dichotomy is what to do if you have a suboptimal or a sub-performing team member. Because there's the choice. You can remove them or keep them. And often if you remove somebody, you're not going to get a replacement. So it's not easy. The main thing is to continue to try and help both your subordinates, your peers, and your leaders to be the best they can possibly be. And this, in part, is why the authors relate their military um, chapters they were commanding so successful, because they helped people as individuals get the most out of themselves. So if you've got an underperformer, don't just fire them, take them aside, find out a bit about what they're struggling with, make an effort to help that underperformer achieve well. If, however, despite doing your best efforts and then putting in their best efforts, it looks like it doesn't work, at that point you may have to say, well, it's time to perhaps let you go. And when we think about training as well, there's another dichotomy, because on one hand, you can make it too easy, and then it's not challenging, and particularly when it comes to things like war, the book goes into great detail about how accurate and realistic the training scenarios were, so that then when people are in battle, that actually other soldiers would say, oh, you're clearly very good at this, you've seen a lot of combat before, even though that's their first time. So on one hand, it's making it too easy, which you don't want to do, but the other is too difficult, because that's just soul crushing to your team. So getting the best training program that pushes people hard, far beyond their comfort zone, but not that hard, so they can collectively learn from mistakes from the training. And when we think about the style of leadership, the book has an interesting concept in which it mentions being aggressive. And what that means about aggression isn't actually being physically aggressive or verbally aggressive. There's generally no reason to shout at people and lose your cool with them. The main thing is about an aggressive pursuit of the goal. So it's really a purposeful, a proactive pursuit of the goal. And when you have also in the military, there's another dichotomy between aggression and logic, because often you think, well, we'll just push harder, we'll do this stronger, and we'll succeed. And maybe that is the case, but sometimes taking a step back and thinking, what is the best way forward here? And, you know, it is logic versus the actual aggressive tactic, because problems aren't going to solve themselves, and aggression is just one way. And that goes with the same in both the battlefield and in business. It's having a critical thinking and purposeful attitude in which you're solving problems. The problem to get excited about is the thing you're doing, not your peers or your people who report to you or the people you may report to. Equally, there is this balance between being passive and aggressive. So if you're too passive, sitting around waiting for solutions, you won't actually achieve as much as you could. Be mindful that you really do need to take a moment or two to think about what the enemy's true intentions are, or that may be the competition. And if somebody's given you prudent counsel, you'd be very foolish to disregard this. See, leading is not just about pushing your agenda, it's about thinking strategically what is the best way to achieve the mission or the goal. Of course, that needs planning, but then there's another dichotomy between planning and over-planning. So the difficulties with over-planning are it takes a lot of time, and then in this situation, when things don't work out quite as you had thought it may be, you may be then in a state of paralysis thinking, well, what do we do? So avoid over-planning. So how do you plan correctly? Well, that's to think about what the likely things that may occur are, and make contingency plans in advance that are flexible enough so that when an obstacle comes, and there will be obstacles in your leadership journey, you're able to be effective and make a flexible path to navigate that obstacle in the best way. Thinking about your own characteristics as a leader, humility is key. There is no point ever in thinking that you're above other people. However, you need to also not be too humble, because you still do need to stand up for what you believe is right and what will help your team. So only very occasionally, particularly in the military, would you be questioning higher up orders. So don't do this often. But if you are absolutely thinking this is overlooking something, then certainly articulate your concerns and try to provide a useful solution that could help. So you need to be humble enough to listen to other people's ideas, willing to learn from them, implementing new, better tactics and strategies, constantly learning. But you still need to be able to stand firm and be aware that at times there will be unintended consequences from your decisions, but you do need to be attentive enough to the details to hopefully make the best decisions that you can. So, when your team is on the verge of disaster, it's time for the senior leader to put detachment aside and step into the fray, to solve the problems and to help the team. That's the time to lead. Once problems are getting solved, the leader can then step back into a position of detachment. And as with all dichotomies, for example, being strong and not overbearing, just being aware of these challenges and these opposing forces can really help you on your leadership journey. So what do you think? Feel free to comment below, like and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you next time.